On a fog-covered train in 1928, two 11-year-old twins vanished without a trace. 96 years later, the evidence that surfaced would shock investigators and rewrite history. On a fog-covered stretch of railway in the autumn of 1928, the night air hung thick and unmoving, swallowing the sound of the passing train as it carved its way through the darkness. In one of the sleeper compartments near the middle of the Chicago-St. Paul line, 11-year-old twins Elsie and Henry Whitford settled into their narrow bunks beside their exhausted mother. The family had boarded quietly, their luggage neatly stacked, their tickets checked without incident. Nothing about them suggested they would become the center of one of the most perplexing disappearances in American railway history. Shortly after midnight, the train slipped into a valley where fog drifted across the tracks like sheets of pale smoke. Passengers recalled the silence of that stretch, how conversation died out and even the lamps seemed to dim. In the Whitford compartment, the mother drifted in and out of sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of wheels beneath her. She remembered later that she felt a cool breeze against her cheek, a sensation that didn't match the sealed, heated compartments. When she forced her eyes open, the children's bunks were empty. Their blankets were neatly folded back, but the twins themselves were gone. She assumed at first that they had wandered into the hallway, perhaps searching for the bathroom, but when she slid open the door, the corridor was vacant. The lamps flickered. A conductor on duty approached at her frantic calls, but insisted that every door on the car had remained locked since the train left Chicago. No one had stepped off. No one had stepped on. The compartment windows, he reminded her, were bolted from the inside and nearly impossible for a child to open. Panic spread swiftly from compartment to compartment. Passengers were roused from sleep, groggy voices joined the anxious commotion, and the conductor's whistle cut through the corridor as he summoned railway officers. Each sleeper cabin was inspected, each lavatory checked, each coupling between cars examined for signs that the children might have slipped or fallen. Nothing. No footprints. No torn fabric. No marks of struggle. By the time the train reached the next station, telegraphs were dispatched in every direction. Within hours, newspapers printed the earliest accounts. Twins vanish from moving train. Investigators boarded, tearing apart the compartment with methodical precision, searching for any breach, any clue, any explanation for how two children disappeared without stirring a single witness. And then investigators noticed the scratches on the window frame. The scratches on the window frame changed the tone of the investigation instantly. What had felt like a bizarre but explainable disappearance now carried the weight of deliberate interference. Investigators crouched beneath the narrow compartment window, tracing the shallow marks with gloved fingertips. They were thin, irregular, and angled downward, suggesting someone had tried to pry the window open from the inside, despite the near-impossible design meant to keep passengers, especially children, safely contained. As the authorities disembarked onto the gravel beside the rural station, lanterns bobbed through the mist like drifting fireflies. Dozens of volunteers from the nearby town arrived before sunrise, forming search lines that stretched into the tree line. The terrain surrounding the tracks was unforgiving, thickets of bramble, steep ravines carved by decades of runoff, and a marshland that swallowed footprints within minutes. Despite hours combing through the dense fog and brittle underbrush, not a single trace of Elsie or Henry emerged. The lead investigator ordered a full sweep of the train, compartment by compartment. They questioned every passenger a second time, pushing past the haze of half-slept memories and contradictory impressions. A schoolteacher insisted she heard soft footsteps in the corridor around midnight, though she couldn't say if they belonged to a child or an adult. A businessman recalled seeing a faint silhouette near the twins' compartment door shortly after departure, but dismissed it as a porter. Another woman claimed everything was silent until the mother's screams woke the entire car. Even the staff offered differing stories. The night conductor swore he had locked every end door himself. A young porter admitted he had seen the Whitford children awake earlier in the evening, whispering to each other as though sharing a secret. Yet a second porter insisted they were asleep long before the train entered the fog. By late afternoon, the investigators reached the edge of a ravine where the tracks curved sharply along a cliff. Here they paused, studying the drop. If the twins had fallen, the bodies would have been found. If they had jumped, someone would have heard. The silence of the night, the locked doors, the undisturbed beds, all pointed to an impossible conclusion. Rumors seeped quickly into the public. Some whispered of kidnappers who knew the railway schedule. Others believed the twins never boarded the train at all. The newspapers latched onto the uncertainty, amplifying fear with every headline. As daylight faded, a porter approached the sheriff hesitantly, eyes downcast. He confessed he had seen a man in a long coat standing near the Whitford compartment minutes before departure. Someone he didn't recognize among the staff. And that confession would be the first hint that the case was far from ordinary. The porter's hesitant confession should have reignited urgency, but instead it deepened the confusion that already clouded the investigation. The description he provided, a tall man in a long coat with a stiff, almost mechanical posture, matched no employee on the roster. Yet there was no record of an unauthorized boarding, no ticket purchased under an alias, and no witness who could confirm the man's presence once the train was in motion. The investigators added his statement to the growing file, but without further leads, it remained little more than a troubling fragment. Weeks passed. The search radius expanded from the ravines near the tracks to distant farmsteads and abandoned outbuildings. Bloodhounds were brought in, but their noses led them in conflicting directions before losing the scent entirely. Flyers bearing the twins' faces fluttered on telephone poles, edges curling in the wind. Each new lead dissolved into the same dead end. No bodies, no sightings, no evidence of a struggle, no trace of the mysterious man in the coat. Inside the Whitford home, the silence thickened. The mother clung to the belief that her children had been taken, not lost. She repeated the same details to detectives until her voice trembled. How Henry never slept deeply, how Elsie was afraid of strangers, how neither child would have climbed out a narrow train window willingly. But none of her pleas could counter the uncomfortable truth swallowing the case. There was simply nothing left to investigate. Railway officials pressed heavily for closure. Their reputation had taken a beating in the press, and newspapers were now questioning safety protocols, staff oversight, and even the company's integrity. The longer the case remained open, the more scrutiny fell upon them. Under growing corporate pressure, the lead detective reluctantly agreed to classify the matter as unresolved disappearance, a phrase that felt like a betrayal each time he wrote it. In early December, the official report was stamped, bound, and shelved. Case File 1928, one of the thinnest major investigations in the department's history, contained fewer answers than it had questions. The Whitford family drifted into the margins of local memory, visited occasionally only by sympathetic neighbors or curious reporters searching for a fading human interest story. But the mother's resolve never broke. Days before she left town, she delivered a handwritten letter to the station chief, insisting that one detail had been ignored. The scratches on the window frame were made by someone desperate to get out, or desperate to warn someone within. The letter was quietly filed away and forgotten. Nearly a century later, it would be the first document pulled from the sealed evidence box. Nearly a century passed before anyone opened the Whitford file again. In 2024, the Railway Historical Preservation Project began digitizing thousands of aging documents stored in the basement archive of a decommissioned station in Minnesota. The building itself was a relic, dust-laden brick walls, flickering overhead bulbs, and shelves stacked with evidence boxes whose labels had long faded into yellowed smudges. Most held routine records, outdated tickets, employment logs, broken pocket watches. But one box, buried behind a row of water-stained ledgers, was marked with a stenciled warning, "Do not release." An intern named Clara Avery found it only because the shelf beneath had collapsed, spilling its contents across the concrete. As she gathered the scattered files, the stamped words caught her eye. The box felt unusually heavy when she lifted it, its lid sealed with rusted metal clips that groaned when forced open. Inside lay a strange assortment of objects, none matching the standardized storage protocols of the era. There was a brittle compartment registration log from 1928, its ink faded but legible enough to show the name Whitford in neat cursive. Beside it rested a small rusted metal object wrapped in a cloth that had once been white. And beneath both items, cushioned carefully between sheets of crumbling paper, was a single glass photographic plate. Its surface darkened with age, its edges chipped from decades of neglect. Clara hesitated before touching it. Items this fragile were usually handled only by archivists. But something about the plate's weight, its stillness, urged her to look closer. When held against the dim light, she could make out the faint impression of a corridor, long, narrow, and shadowed. Following protocol, she documented the discovery and forwarded the box to the regional FBI cold case division, which had recently partnered with the project for potential historical recoveries. The sealed plate immediately caught the attention of special analyst Daniel Reeve, who specialized in restoring photographic evidence. Most plates from that era were too degraded to rescue, but this one, remarkably, retained enough emulsion to justify digital enhancement. Reeve loaded it into the forensic scanner, expecting nothing more than indistinct silhouettes. Instead, as the first layers of haze were digitally peeled back, shapes sharpened. A corridor emerged, then two small figures, then the faint outline of a larger form at the far end of the frame. Reeve's breath caught. The timestamp etched into the corner confirmed the impossible. The image had been captured the very night the Whitford twins vanished. He leaned closer as the software clarified the final details. "You're not going to believe what's on this photograph," he whispered, already reaching for the phone that would reopen a case closed for 96 years. The image took nearly an hour to stabilize. Layer by layer, the software stripped away scratches, dust interference, and chemical decay that had settled across the plate like a veil. What emerged was sharper than anything Reeve expected from a photograph captured in 1928. The corridor of the sleeper car stretched ahead, narrow, lit by weak sconces, and emptied of passengers. But the light pooled strangely around two figures standing halfway down the passage. Even blurred, their posture was unmistakable. A boy and a girl of the same height, side by side, turned as though caught mid-step. Elsie and Henry Whitford. Reeve zoomed in, adjusting the clarity until the faint outlines of the twins' faces appeared. They were not smiling. Their expressions were tense, alert, their bodies angled toward something or someone. At the far end of the corridor. That was when the silhouette came into focus. A tall figure stood nearly motionless, positioned just outside the lamplight. At first the shape seemed like little more than darkness, but enhancement revealed a long coat, a hat tilted low, and a posture that suggested the figure was watching the children rather than passing by them. Reeve studied the silhouette's right hand. It hovered near the metal latch of the compartment window, as though the figure had been adjusting it or preparing to. The angle of the wrist matched the very spot where investigators had found scratches 96 years earlier. The implication was immediate and chilling. If the image was authentic, someone had been inside the same stretch of hallway shortly before the twins vanished. Someone unaccounted for in every official report. The timestamp carved into the corner, June 14, 1928, 017, placed it minutes before the mother claimed she woke to find the beds empty. Reeve forwarded the restored image to his supervisor, who escalated the case within the hour. A forensic team gathered in the lab, reviewing the evidence the old archive had accidentally preserved. When one technician examined the edges of the plate, she found something the archivists had missed entirely. Faint fingerprints preserved in the emulsion, trapped beneath protective layers for nearly a century. The prints were lifted with delicate precision and run through the national database. No one expected a match. Prints from the 1920s were rarely catalogued. But the system returned a result almost immediately, an impossible one. The fingerprints belonged to Marcus Vale, a railway inspector recorded as having died in 1919. Reeve reread the result twice, then stared again at the silhouette on the screen. If Vale was dead years before the disappearance, someone had falsified more than just the original investigation. And whoever that figure was, they had stood only feet from the twins in their final recorded moments. The lead from the glass plate had carried investigators into a dim, dust-laden corner of the town's forgotten history, but nothing prepared them for the name that surfaced next, if it could even be called a name. The archival clerk, An elderly man with trembling hands and a memory sharper than the files around him, paused when he saw the blurred figure in the photograph. He didn't recognize the children, nor the park, but the adult silhouette standing behind them made his expression darken. He whispered a name that didn't appear in any census, any employment log, or any municipal archive from 1932. Mr. Calder. It sounded fabricated, like a placeholder someone used when they didn't want the real name recorded. Yet the clerk insisted the town once knew a man by that title. Not a first name, not an occupation, just Mr. Calder. A shadow drifting at the edges of community events, always present but never documented. A man who appeared in memories, but not on paper. When the team searched the archives for verification, they confirmed the worst. There was nothing. No birth certificate, no residence, no tax filings, no school records, not even a newspaper mention. He was a man who had somehow lived without leaving a single conventional trace. The only evidence he existed at all came from fragile recollections, stories half forgotten by elderly residents who spoke of him with a strange blend of familiarity and discomfort. One remembered him standing behind the church on summer evenings. Another recalled him handing out wrapped candies to children during fairs, though she insisted she never saw him eat or drink anything himself. A third remembered his eyes, gray, unblinking, watchful in a way that made even adults keep their distance. But every witness agreed on one unsettling detail. Wherever children gathered, Mr. Calder was never far behind. As investigators cross-checked these statements with the newly uncovered photograph, an emerging pattern formed, geographically, chronologically, and chillingly tight. Calder had appeared at least 6 events involving children in the months surrounding the disappearance. Always in the background, always on the periphery, always unnoticed until remembered decades later. Yet the question that pressed hardest was the simplest one. How does someone exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time? A deeper search revealed something even stranger. In 1933, 1 year after the cousins vanished, 5 separate families reported a man fitting Calder's description attempting to speak to their children late at night near their homes. The cases were dismissed at the time as unrelated incidents, attributed to paranoia during a tense year. Now, every one of them pointed toward a single, nameless figure. The chapter closed not with answers, but with the sense that they were finally approaching the perimeter of someone's carefully buried truth, one that had remained untouched for nearly a century, and one that was about to surface. The deeper investigators dug, the more the story splintered into fragments that refused to align. Witness statements, once assumed credible, now clashed at nearly every point. The schoolteacher who had insisted she heard footsteps along the corridor now admitted, decades later, that she had been half asleep and might have mistaken the twins' voices for the rattling of the train. The businessman who claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the hallway altered his timeline under questioning, moving the sighting forward by 10 minutes. Even the porters, whose statements had formed the backbone of the original report, contradicted each other in ways that suggested deliberate obfuscation. Investigators began cross-referencing these inconsistencies with railway logs, personal letters, and archived photographs. Each small discrepancy became a thread leading to an even more tangled weave. One passenger's recollection, once dismissed as trivial, now aligned with the scratches found on the compartment window, a detail that the original inquiry had never fully addressed. Another recollection suggested the twins had been restless earlier in the evening, whispering secrets to each other. But a third witness insisted the children were asleep, silent and still, right up to the moment they vanished. The investigators focused on the porter's testimony. One, long retired and living in a neighboring county, finally admitted the truth he had withheld for decades. He had seen a man enter the Whitford compartment minutes before departure, the same figure captured decades later on the restored glass plate. At the time, he had been threatened by a supervisor to forget everything. For nearly a century, he had followed that warning. As the team began analyzing the physical evidence again, the window frame, the scratched latch, and the rusted metal objects preserved in the archive, they discovered another layer of intentional concealment. In a hidden compartment of the evidence box lay a fragment of the twins' blanket, carefully folded and tucked beneath old ledgers. Chemical analysis revealed traces of a sedative that would have rendered two children lethargic but not unconscious, suggesting a plan more calculated than an impulsive abduction. These revelations prompted a deeper look into the discrepancies themselves. Why had so many accounts conflicted? Why had the porters, passengers, and even family members misremembered or concealed details? Each contradiction hinted at an unseen force guiding what information reached investigators, and what was buried. The chapter closed as detectives assembled the restored photograph alongside the physical artifacts, staring at the parallel stories they told. Somewhere in the inconsistencies, in the whispered confessions and altered recollections, lay the path to understanding. And as they prepared to trace the threads further, one fact became chillingly clear. Someone had orchestrated not just the disappearance, but the history of the disappearance itself. The next lead would come from a source long ignored: the mother's secret letter. Among the archived items that had remained untouched for decades, one small envelope stood out. Its edges were brittle, its paper yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakably delicate and precise. Clara Avery, the intern who had first discovered the glass plate, carefully unfolded it and held the letter to the light. Each line carried the weight of a mother's desperation, her fear encoded in loops and flourishes that had survived nearly a century. The letter had never been mailed. Addressed vaguely to the one who can protect them, it described events the original investigation had overlooked or perhaps ignored. The mother recounted how, in the weeks leading up to the train departure, she had noticed a man lingering near her home and the children's school, always observing, always silent. He carried a presence that unsettled the family, though no one dared confront him directly. She wrote that she had received indirect threats, a whispered warning that the twins had seen something they shouldn't have, something connected to her husband's business dealings during the Prohibition era. She confessed her own fear, that if the children were taken, she could never guarantee they would be returned safely. Yet she also hinted at a plan, an attempt to protect them from harm even if she could not understand the full scope of the danger. Lines of the letter detailed small precautions she had tried to implement: keeping the children's departure time secret, locking their belongings, and instructing household staff to be watchful. Every effort, she concluded, had been insufficient against a force she could not name. The language of the letter carried a subtle warning. Someone close, someone with knowledge of the family's routine, was involved. The mother's handwriting trembled as she described her suspicion of a railway employee who had been overly helpful, watching the family more intently than necessary. "If something happens to them," she wrote, "look for the man with the silver watch. He carries more than metal in his hands." When the investigators read the letter, their understanding of the case shifted. This was not a random disappearance. It was targeted. The letter confirmed a connection between the mysterious figure in the archival photograph and the events surrounding the twins' vanishing. More importantly, it suggested that the clues preserved for nearly a century, the scratches, the photograph, and even the tiny metal object wrapped in cloth, were not coincidental. The discovery of the letter prompted a new line of inquiry. The silver watch mentioned repeatedly might hold the key to uncovering the identity of the person who orchestrated the twins' disappearance. The mention of a silver watch in the mother's letter became the focal point of the renewed investigation. Investigators began tracing Marcus Vale's personal effects through archives, estate sales, and surviving family connections. Most of his belongings had long since been discarded or donated, but a single metal tin emerged, labeled simply MV. Inside lay an assortment of tools, a worn leather journal, and on top, a silver pocket watch engraved with the railway company's crest. The engraving was faint but legible, a date etched carefully on the back, June 14, 1928, matching the night the twins disappeared. Investigators examined the watch closely, noting scratches on its surface that aligned with the edges of the compartment window latch seen in the archival photograph. Forensic teams swabbed the watch for biological traces, and the results were startling. Residues of two children's DNA, confirmed to be Elsie and Henry, and, unexpectedly, traces of an adult female, likely their mother. The implications were immediate and chilling. Whoever had held this watch that night had touched the children and interacted with their environment directly. It suggested premeditation and, at the same time, a strange connection between the mother and Marcus Vale. Was she involved in a desperate attempt to protect them? Or had she unknowingly crossed paths with a man who would exploit every opportunity to control the situation? Further analysis revealed that the watch contained a hidden compartment, long overlooked by collectors and descendants alike. Inside were tiny notes, written in faint pencil, detailing train schedules, compartment numbers, and subtle instructions. Keep them unseen. Remove witnesses. Station arrival, 2:17. The level of precision suggested a man who operated systematically, someone deeply familiar with the railways and willing to manipulate records to his advantage. The team mapped these instructions against the historical train route, finding startling coincidences with stops where the twins could have been moved without anyone noticing. Each detail, each calculation, hinted at a network of silent enablers, railway employees, townsfolk, perhaps even family acquaintances, whose roles had been obscured by fear or complicity. By the end of the day, the investigation had narrowed its focus. The silver watch was not merely a personal item but a tool of orchestration, a relic that had preserved the last tangible evidence of the twins' fate. The team realized the next step lay somewhere along the abandoned maintenance tracks, a place Vale had once controlled, and a location that could finally reveal what had become of Elsie and Henry. The hunt was no longer about speculation. It was about uncovering the hidden car where history had been carefully erased. The silver watch had revealed a trail, one that led investigators to a section of abandoned rail yards on the outskirts of a small Minnesota town. Satellite maps from the 1920s showed a narrow spur line, long since removed from regular service, where maintenance cars had been stored and largely forgotten. Dust-choked and rusting, the sheds still held the skeletal remains of wooden cars, their paint blistered, their wheels frozen in time. Forensic teams moved cautiously, aware that every detail could carry nearly a century's worth of evidence. Inside one of the cars, investigators discovered what they were not expecting: the faint outlines of child-sized handprints pressed into layers of dust and oil along the wooden walls. Beneath the grime, patterns of wear indicated repeated presence, as if someone or two someones had spent extended time here. The floorboards bore shallow scratches in the same configuration as the twins' shoes would have left, suggesting movement consistent with children confined within. A metal drawer, partially concealed behind a loose panel, contained a torn railway timetable. The paper was fragile but legible, with two names circled in careful pencil: Elsie and Henry. The timing aligned with the departure from Chicago, the recorded disappearance, and the minute notations etched into the silver watch. Investigators began piecing together a theory. Marcus Vale had transferred the twins from the sleeper car into this hidden space, bypassing the main stations entirely. It was meticulous, deliberate, and designed to leave no trace. Chemical analysis of the surfaces revealed traces of a sedative, consistent with substances used during the era for animal handling or minor medical procedures. It was enough to calm two children without rendering them unconscious, suggesting Vale intended to maintain control rather than inflict immediate harm. Evidence also suggested the presence of additional items, likely removed by others: blankets, scraps of clothing, and small personal objects, deliberate removals intended to erase identity and delay recognition. The team reconstructed the movements, cross-referencing the timetable, watch notations, and archival witness accounts. The hidden car had been a temporary holding space, a buffer between the twins' known environment and the world outside. It explained the inconsistencies, the contradictory statements, and the months-long absence of leads. Yet even with the physical evidence, one question remained unanswered: what became of the children after Vale left the car? Clues hinted they were not harmed immediately, but no records showed where they went next. The search would need to extend beyond tracks and timetables, into human memory, surviving testimony, and documents once thought irrelevant. As night fell over the rail yard, investigators stepped back from the car, knowing the next breakthrough would come not from metal or dust, but from someone who had witnessed, intentionally or accidentally, their final moments. And that witness would carry the secret for decades. The trail from the hidden train car led investigators into conversations with the last living witnesses from that era, though by 2024, such individuals were extremely rare. One stood out, a 102-year-old former bootleg courier, known only as Samuel Hayes. Frail but alert, he lived alone in a weathered farmhouse, his mind sharp with memory honed by decades of retelling events that others had long forgotten. When asked about the Whitford twins, his eyes widened, and he insisted they had not vanished as most believed. They had survived the first night. Hayes described the twins' disappearance in detail, drawing a vivid picture of the night Marcus Vale moved them from the sleeper compartment into the hidden car. The children, he said, had accidentally witnessed a clandestine exchange between Vale and other railway workers involved in smuggling operations. Their presence was not tolerated. Vale, however, had hesitated when he realized the children were too young to understand the gravity of what they had seen. Instead of harming them immediately, he transported them to a secluded safe house outside the city, a place Hayes had visited once under necessity for courier work. According to Hayes, the twins stayed there for months, watched over by Vale under strict instructions, fed, clothed, and kept hidden from the authorities. Their survival, he claimed, was fragile, dependent on Vale's conflicted conscience. Hayes recalled seeing them once through a partially open door, Henry clutching a small, frayed notebook, Elsie whispering questions to a woman who had come briefly with messages. The children were aware of their isolation, but they were alive, wary yet unharmed physically. The courier's recollections confirmed much of what the physical evidence suggested: the hidden car, the timing, and the repeated manipulation of records. Hayes also explained why many witnesses had given contradictory accounts over the decades. The twins had been moved multiple times, and those aware of their location had been sworn to secrecy, either out of fear or loyalty to Vale. Each discrepancy, he revealed, was intentional, a carefully constructed web to obscure the children's movements. Most haunting, however, was Hayes' final revelation. The children had not simply vanished into the night after the safe house. One day, in 1930, they had been placed into a rural orphanage under new identities, their true names erased from records. A photograph survived, showing two small children whose features mirrored the Whitfords, standing silently outside the orphanage, gazing toward the camera as though aware of the attention they could never fully escape. And with that photograph, the century-old mystery finally narrowed to a singular truth. The twins had survived the train, but only to vanish again into obscurity, leaving investigators to piece together the echoes of their lives. The photograph from 1930 became the final tangible link to Elsie and Henry Whitford. The children stood in the doorway of the rural orphanage, their small hands clasped, faces pale and watchful. Even decades later, the image seemed to radiate a quiet tension, as if the twins themselves understood that history had nearly erased them. Investigators pored over every detail. The clothing matched descriptions of what they wore the night of the train, the height and posture aligned with archival records, and the eyes. The eyes told a story words could never capture. They were alert, cautious, aware of a world that had moved on without them. Orphanage records, damaged by a fire in 1932, offered little clarity. Names were lost, logbooks reduced to ashes, and any trace of the twins' subsequent lives vanished. Yet surviving adoption ledgers hinted at two children matching their ages, placed in separate households under new identities. The trail ended not in bodies or confessions, but in paper fragments and faint recollections, leaving the investigators to reconstruct a narrative built on shadows. As the modern team revisited the archival evidence, the scratches on the compartment window, the glass plate, the silver watch, the hidden train car, and the mother's secret letter, a pattern emerged. The story of the Whitford twins was less about what happened in a single night and more about the years of secrecy, manipulation, and survival that followed. The orchestrator, Marcus Vale, had vanished from history long before accountability could reach him, leaving only artifacts and whispered memories as testimony to his deeds. Despite the century-long gap, the case resonated with a human truth. Children had vanished not through accident, but through the calculated interference of adults, whose choices rippled across decades. The investigators felt both closure and despair. The twins had survived the immediate danger, yet their lives were forever fragmented, scattered, and unknown. The legacy of that night lingered in the scratches, the photographs, the letters, and the faint echo of tiny footsteps along abandoned tracks. In the end, the case could not restore names or reunite the family. It could, however, honor what remained: the evidence of survival, the faint traces of identity, and the acknowledgement that history had overlooked them for too long. And as the team archived the final reports, the restored glass plate was placed side by side with the 1930 photograph, an enduring reminder. Some mysteries do not end. They fade into silence, leaving only echoes along the tracks, waiting for someone to listen. Thanks for watching.